The champagne cork made a sound like a small gunshot before my daughter's laugh cut over it, and for a second every person at that table turned toward her instead of toward me. Not a mean laugh, not loud, just short and bright and satisfied, the specific sound of someone who has been holding her breath for a long time and has finally been told she can let it out. My daughter Renee laughed at the reading of my will. I was sitting at the head of that table, 71 years old, my heart doing exactly what it was supposed to do, watching my own family celebrate a document that hadn't finished being read yet. Finally, she said, not quite under her breath. Finally, some sense in this family. Every person in that dining room in Sacramento, California, my brother Gerald, my daughter-in-law's mother, who I'd invited more out of habit than closeness, my attorney Priscilla Vance sitting at the far end with the folder still open in front of her, every one of them looked at Renee and then looked at me, and I watched something pass across their faces that I recognized because I'd felt it myself once, a long time ago, at a table very much like this one. It was the specific look of people watching someone celebrate before they know what they're celebrating. Priscilla had read exactly one paragraph, one, and Renee had already decided the rest didn't matter. I need to take you back before I take you into that dining room, because the champagne and the laugh and what happened 4 minutes later only makes sense if you understand the 18 months that built up to it, and what one 17-year-old girl had figured out that every adult in my family had either missed or had chosen very deliberately not to see. My name is Walter Pruitt. I'm 71 years old. I built Pruitt & Sons millwork from a single table saw in a rented garage on Del Paso Boulevard in 1979. The same year, my wife Margaret and I got married in her mother's backyard because we couldn't afford anything grander and didn't want to. 45 years later, Pruitt Millwork does custom cabinetry and architectural woodwork for homes and businesses across 3 counties, employs 41 people, and has a waiting list that runs 8 months long. Margaret ran the books for the first 20 years. She had a memory for numbers that put mine to shame, and a way of reading a room that I never came close to matching, and when she died 4 years ago, in the spring, of the kind of cancer that doesn't announce itself until it's already won, I understood for the first time exactly how much of that business, and how much of me, had been standing on her shoulders without either of us saying so out loud. Renee is my only daughter. She's 46, married to a man named Curtis who sells commercial insurance and has never, in 11 years of marriage, asked me a single question about how the shop actually runs. Renee herself works in event planning, does it well, makes decent money, and for most of her adult life had a relationship to Pruitt Millwork I can only describe as polite indifference. She grew up around the smell of sawdust and finish coat, the way a person grows up around a familiar street present, unremarkable, not something she thought to examine because it had simply always been there. Margaret's death changed that indifference into something else. In the first year after Margaret passed, Renee started coming around the shop more. Not constantly, not in a way that would have looked strange to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, but steadily. She'd stop by on her lunch hour. She'd call in the evenings to check on me, and the conversation would drift, always gently, always with what sounded like genuine concern, toward the business. How the Fentress contract was going, whether I'd thought about what happens to the shop if something happened to me, whether I'd had the place appraised recently, just so I'd know, just so it wasn't a mystery to anybody. That was one way to read it. A daughter who'd lost her mother and was frightened, in the ordinary human way, of losing her father too, trying to stay close to the only parent she had left. The other way to read it didn't occur to me until much later, when I remembered a Sunday dinner from 3 years before Margaret died, at our house on Winding Way, when Margaret had mentioned in passing, at the table, over pot, roast roughly what the shop was worth, if you added up the equipment and the contracts and the goodwill built over 3 decades. She hadn't given a number. She'd given a shape, big enough to matter, big enough to remember. Renee had been sitting right there, 29 years old, half listening the way people half listen to their parents talk business at the dinner table, and I hadn't thought about that evening again for 11 years. Until my attorney asked me a question I wasn't expecting. Priscilla Vance had handled my legal affairs for almost 20 years, ever since the shop got big enough to need someone who understood succession planning and not just contracts. About 2 years after Margaret died, I sat in her office on the ninth floor of a building on J Street to talk about updating my estate plan. Something I'd been putting off the way you put off anything that requires admitting you won't be here forever. And Priscilla set down her pen and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Walter, she said, has Renee said anything to you about specific expectations for the business? I asked her what she meant by specific. I had a call 3 weeks ago, Priscilla said, choosing her words with the particular care of a lawyer who's about to tell you something she's not entirely comfortable saying, from an attorney in Roseville named Adam Kessler. He said he was reaching out on behalf of a client who had questions about business valuation methods for family-owned companies and about how estates like yours typically get structured when there's an operating business involved. He didn't name the client, but he was specific enough about the size and structure of the company that it wasn't a general inquiry. It was about a particular business. A pause. I didn't confirm or deny anything, but I thought you should know someone had been asking. I sat in that office and thought about pot roast on Winding Way, and about a 29-year-old half listening at the table, and about the calls that had started coming more often after Margaret died. Always warm, always concerned, always eventually circling back to the shop. And what I felt wasn't shock. It was the particular, unpleasant click of a picture finishing itself after you've spent a year and a half looking at pieces of it without wanting to see the whole. Priscilla, I said, I need your help doing something. She picked up her pen again. I need to redo the estate plan, and I need to do it quietly. Nobody outside this office knows what's in it until I decide it's time. She wrote something down, then looked up. All of it? All of it. We spent 5 months building the new structure. But before I tell you what was actually in that folder Priscilla laid on the dining room table, I need to tell you about my granddaughter. Sophie Pruitt is 17 years old. She's Renee and Curtis's daughter, my only grandchild, 5'4" with her grandmother's exact way of tilting her head when she's deciding whether to say something or hold on to it a little longer. She has Margaret's eyes, not the color, the quality of them, the way they land on the real thing in a room before anyone said it out loud. She's been my Sunday person since Margaret died. Nobody arranged it. The first Sunday after the funeral, Sophie showed up at my house on Winding Way at 9 in the morning with a backpack and a question about whether I wanted company, and she was 13 years old, and her parents hadn't sent her. She decided, on her own, in the quiet and unannounced way that kids sometimes decide things that matter more than the adults around them realize, that her grandfather needed someone on Sundays, and that she was available. 4 years later, she's still coming. We go into the shop together most weekends. I taught her to run a router before she could parallel park, and we talk, over sawdust and coffee, about school, about the business, about her grandmother. She asks the kind of questions that tell me she's filing the answers away somewhere they matter to her. She asked me once, about a year after Margaret died, whether I ever worried about what happened to the shop after I was gone. She was 14. I told her the truth, that it was something I thought about constantly and was trying to get right. She nodded, in that considering way of hers, and then she said something I've carried with me since. Grandma used to say the difference between the people who build something and the people who just want what it's worth is that the builders never stop asking what it needs. The other kind only ever asks what it's worth to them. I asked her when Grandma had said that. A long time ago, Sophie said. Before she got sick. I didn't really get it then. She looked down at the workbench between us. I think I get it now. Margaret had said that to a 13-year-old, 2 years before she died, the way Margaret planted everything without announcing the planting, without explaining the purpose of the seed, trusting the right season to bring it up out of the ground on its own. And sitting in that shop with my granddaughter, I understood that Margaret had seen something coming that I was still catching up to, and that she had left an instruction in a child's memory because she trusted the moment would find it when it needed finding. If you're watching this right now, and something in the last few minutes landed somewhere real, if there's a business, a house, a piece of land, 45 years of your life, that somebody in your family has been circling with questions, dressed up as concern, I want you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button, drop a comment and tell me, grandson, granddaughter, whoever you are to me tonight, where in the world you're watching this from. I read every one of them. And tap that like button, because what comes next is the part of this story that actually matters. The right moment was still 5 months away. Let me tell you about the 3 weeks before the will reading, and about what Sophie did that I didn't find out about until she stood up at that dining room table. The reading itself was scheduled by Renee, not by me, not by Priscilla. Renee called Priscilla's office in the fall to ask, given my age, and given that Margaret's passing had made everyone a little more aware of mortality, whether it might be wise to review the estate documents as a family, sooner rather than later, before anything happened that required it. Before anything happened that required it. I was 71 and healthy. My cardiologist had cleared me in September without a note of concern. The shop was running well under the management team I'd built out over the previous 3 years specifically, so it wouldn't collapse the day I couldn't show up anymore. Priscilla called me that same afternoon. Renee reached out. She said Renee had described it as wanting to understand the family's financial picture for her own planning purposes. Her own planning purposes. I told Priscilla to schedule it, whatever date worked. Send the invitations wide, Renee and Curtis, my brother Gerald, and his wife, 2 of my longest tenured employees who I'd named as interested parties in the new structure, and Sophie. Priscilla asked whether Sophie needed to be there, given her age. I told her Sophie had been present, in every way that mattered, for the last 2 years of decisions about this family's future, and that I needed her in that room. The reading was set for the second Saturday in June, 6 in the evening, at my house on Winding Way, over dinner, because Renee had suggested warmly, reasonably, that it would feel less clinical than an office, more like a family occasion. I agreed. I didn't tell her that I'd already had the same thought, for entirely different reasons. 3 weeks before the reading, on a Sunday, Sophie came for her usual visit, and she was quiet in a particular way, the quiet of someone who has something she's working up to saying rather than something she's decided to keep. We finished in the shop, cleaned the sawdust off the bench, sat down at the kitchen table where Margaret used to do the books. Sophie reached into her backpack and pulled out a manila folder and set it down between us. "Grandpa," she said, "I need to show you something, and I need you to tell me if I did the wrong thing." I looked at the folder. "I've been paying attention," she said, "since Grandma died, to how Mom talks about the shop, the calls she makes, what she says to Dad when she thinks I'm not around." She stopped, started again. I remembered what Grandma told me, about builders and the other kind. She looked at the folder like it weighed more than it did. 5 weeks ago, Mom had a call in the kitchen. She thought I'd already gone up to my room. She was talking to someone about what the shop would be worth if it got sold off in pieces instead of run whole, and about whether the contracts would even survive new ownership, and about whether there was a way to get money out of the estate before. She stopped. "Before," I said. "Before you were gone," Sophie said, very quietly. The kitchen was quiet, the way Margaret's kitchen was always quiet on Sunday afternoons. The right kind of quiet. "I recorded it," Sophie said. "I had my phone on the counter, and when I understood what she was talking about, I hit record. I didn't know if that was okay to do. I looked at my granddaughter. "I've been trying to decide for 5 weeks whether to tell you," she said. "And I decided Grandma would have told you. So I'm telling you." I opened the folder. Inside was a printed transcript, 4 pages, run through a transcription app, and formatted with headers and timestamps, because Sophie is 17 and precise, in a way that still catches me off guard. I read every page. Then I picked up my phone and called Priscilla Vance. Priscilla listened to the summary without interrupting, the way a person listens when they've spent 25 years learning that the most important information rarely arrives through the front door. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "Walter, the reading is in 3 weeks." "I know. I want to add one thing to the documents before then, something specific, based on information I didn't have when we built the current structure." She explained what she wanted to add. I told her to add it. She said she'd have it finalized within the week. "The recording," Priscilla said carefully. "I need you to understand something about it. California is a 2-party consent state for recorded conversations, which makes the admissibility complicated, especially involving a minor recording a parent inside her own home. I want to be straightforward with you. I'm not going to submit that recording as evidence in any formal proceeding, and I'd advise you strongly against relying on it that way yourself." I told her I understood. "However," she said, "the contents of the recording aren't what's going into the estate documents. The documents already needed to say what they're going to say. What the recording did was confirm it. It's not evidence, it's context." Context, I said. And context, Priscilla said, has a way of being extremely clarifying to the people sitting in a room when documents get read out loud. On the second Saturday in June, at 6 in the evening, my dining room on Winding Way filled up with the people I'd invited. Renee and Curtis arrived first. Renee already dressed like the evening was a celebration rather than a reading, a bottle of champagne in a gift bag she set on the counter with a little too much ceremony. My brother Gerald and his wife came next. My two employees, Denise Okafor and Marcus Ibarra, took the chairs along the wall closest to the kitchen, and Sophie sat in the chair to my immediate left. Quiet, steady, the specific stillness of someone who has already done the hard part and is simply present now to watch what happens. Priscilla arrived at 5:58. She set her folder in the center of the table. She looked around the room and said, "Thank you all for being here tonight. This is a review of the current estate and business succession documents for Walter James Pruitt. These represent Mr. Pruitt's current, legally executed intentions as of the date on this folder." Renee had the bottle of champagne open before Priscilla finished the sentence. She'd clearly decided, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, exactly what this dinner was going to be, and she was ready to start celebrating the moment the formalities cleared out of the way. Priscilla opened the folder. She read the first line of the first paragraph, a standard opening about the establishment of a family trust, and Renee's face lit up like she'd already heard the number she'd been waiting to hear, and the cork popped, and the laugh came out of her, short and bright, before Priscilla had read a single further word. "Finally," Renee said. "Finally, some sense in this family." The room turned toward her. Then it turned back to Priscilla, who had not stopped reading, whose face had gone into the particular stillness of a professional continuing to do her job regardless of what was happening around her. Priscilla finished the first page. She looked up. She looked at me. I looked back at her with the steadiness of a man who already knew what the rest of the document said. Priscilla set the first page down. She picked up the second. "I need to read several sections aloud," she said, in full, for everyone present. She read the business succession section. Pruitt Millwork was not to be sold, liquidated, or restructured for a period of 3 years following my death or incapacitation. It would continue under the management team already installed Denise Okafor as general manager, with operational authority overseen by a 3-person board of trustees, Priscilla Vance, my brother Gerald, and Denise herself. Renee was not named to the board. Renee held no operational role in the business, now or in the 3-year protection window, in any capacity. The champagne glass in Renee's hand stopped moving toward her mouth. Priscilla read the second section. The house on Winding Way would remain in trust for the duration of the 3-year period, and would then transfer, at that point, to Sophie Pruitt on her 21st birthday, not to Renee and Curtis jointly, with a notation that it had been the family home since 1994 and could not be sold or converted to any other use for a minimum of 15 years after transfer. Renee had gone very still. Curtis had a hand on her arm, and I recognized the pressure of that hand for what it was, not comfort, restraint, the specific grip of a man who knows his wife well enough to know what's coming and is trying to hold it back a few more seconds. Priscilla read the third section. A specific dollar figure, which I'm not going to repeat here, placed in trust for Renee and Curtis, to be administered by Priscilla's office and released in 5 annual installments, beginning 2 years after the triggering event. Not a lump sum, not immediate. 5 years, supervised, 1 payment at a time. Renee's jaw had been tightening since the first section. By the third, it was the jaw of a woman holding something in that she was not going to be able to hold in much longer. Priscilla set down the third page. She looked at the table. Then Sophie stood up. She stood slowly, without any performance in it, without the energy of a teenager who's been waiting for her moment to be seen. She stood with the same careful, deliberate intention she'd had at the kitchen table 3 weeks earlier when she'd decided something, and was now simply carrying it out. She reached into the tote bag hanging off the back of her chair. She took out a sealed envelope. She set it on the table in front of Priscilla. The envelope was addressed, in Sophie's careful handwriting, to Priscilla Vance, attorney at law. "This is for you," Sophie said. "Grandpa knows it's here. Whether to bring it tonight was up to me." Priscilla looked at the envelope, then at me. I gave her a single nod. She picked it up. Every adult at that table was looking at that envelope. Renee's composure, which had been cracking since the first section was read, was now failing outright, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the specific, irreversible way. Composure fails when something external arrives, to confirm what a person has spent months trying to convince themselves wasn't true. Priscilla opened the envelope. Inside was a USB drive and a single handwritten note in Sophie's careful, slightly formal 17-year-old print. She read the note without her expression changing, but something behind her eyes did the same stillness that had crossed her face when she opened the first page of the estate documents. She looked at Sophie. "This is a recording." "Yes." "Of a phone call?" "A conversation in the kitchen, May 14th. I was in the room. Mom didn't know I hadn't gone upstairs yet." Priscilla set the drive and the note down on the table in front of her. She looked at Renee. "Adam Kessler," Renee said. The name came out flat, not as a question. She was naming the things she already understood had been named. Somewhere in that note, or that recording, or both. "The recording and transcript will be reviewed by this office as a matter of record," Priscilla said. "I want to be transparent with everyone at this table that a recording of this kind, made in a private residence, raises real questions about its use in any formal legal setting, and I am not presenting it as evidence of anything. I'm presenting it as context." A pause. "What I will say is that the documents you've heard read tonight reflect Mr. Pruitt's fully informed and carefully considered wishes. They were built over 5 months with complete legal care, and any conversation that took place outside this office about what those documents would say was not based on anything this firm provided." The room went very quiet. Renee looked at me. 46 years of being her father, 17 years of watching her become Sophie's mother, 21 years of watching her be Margaret's daughter. "Dad," she said. I looked at my daughter, at the jaw that was her mother's jaw, at eyes that were mine, at the face of a woman who had spent a year and a half circling something with questions dressed up as concern, now sitting at a table with the entire shape of what she'd been building laid bare in front of everyone she loved. "I know what's on that recording," I said. Level, careful, the voice a man uses when he needs heat to stay out of it, because heat is what an adversary listens for to find the crack. And Renee was not my adversary. She was my daughter, and that was harder in every way that mattered. "I know what you were considering, and I want to say something to you, not as your father's attorney's reading of a document, but as your father talking to you in front of the people who matter to this family. I built Pruitt Millwork for 45 years. Every piece of equipment, every apprentice I trained, every contract we've honored on time for 4 decades, I built it, starting with one table saw in a rented garage when you were 3 years old, and I built it with your mother next to me every single day of it, and there are 41 families right now whose groceries depend on that shop staying whole. You were in our kitchen talking about breaking it into pieces." The room held what that sentence cost to say. "I'm not going to tell you who you are in this moment," I said. "You already know that. What I'm going to tell you is who you have the chance to become over the next 30 days, and what that's going to require of you, and why I still believe, even knowing what I know now, that you're capable of it." Renee looked down at the table. "That's all I'm going to say tonight," I told her. "The rest of it isn't going to happen with an audience." Priscilla closed her folder and asked whether there were any immediate procedural questions. There were none. The reading ended at 6:41. I want to stop here for just a second, because some of you watching this have a Sophie in your life. Someone 17 or 25 or 60 years old who's been noticing something nobody else was paying attention to and carrying the weight of it without knowing whether they're allowed to say it out loud. If that's you, right now, or if it has been, tell me in the comments. Tell me where you're watching this from. I want to know. Husband, wife, son, daughter, whoever you are tonight, and tell me your story, whatever piece of it you're ready to say. And if you've made it this far, hit that subscribe button and that like button, because what happens after that dinner table is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. Renee called me the next morning. Not from the house, not with Curtis in the room from her car, parked outside a coffee shop in Midtown, where she told me later she'd sat for almost 40 minutes trying to decide whether she had the nerve to dial. I picked up on the second ring. The call lasted a little over 40 minutes. She didn't start with an explanation. She didn't start with a defense. She started with silence, The particular silence of a 46-year-old woman who spent an evening watching everything come apart at a table full of people she loved, trying to find the first honest sentence. Then she found it. "I didn't think about the 41 people," she said. "I kept thinking about the number instead. After Mom died, everything felt like it could just come apart. The shop, the house, all of it. And I started thinking about what happens if it does. And somewhere in trying to protect it, I stopped thinking about protecting it and started thinking about what I wanted." A long pause. "The recording," she said. She stopped. Started again. I knew it was wrong while I was saying it. Adam kept telling me there was a legal path if I moved early enough, and I kept listening because I wanted there to be one. I never actually stopped him. I just kept listening. The line was quiet for a moment, just the small sounds of a parking lot somewhere behind her. "Your mother knew," I said. Quiet on the other end. "She told Sophie something about builders and takers, 2 years before she died. She said it to a 13-year-old because she trusted Sophie would still remember it when it mattered." Renee didn't say anything for a second. "She knew," she finally said. "Not a question. She saw it coming before I did," I told her. "She trusted me to catch up eventually, and she trusted Sophie to be the bridge in the meantime." "I didn't know she could see that far ahead," Renee said, and her voice broke a little on it. "Your mother could always see that far ahead. It was one of the things about her I loved most, and never fully matched the way she understood people more precisely than they understood themselves, and used that understanding quietly, in small conversations with 13-year-olds, trusting the right season to bring the seed up on its own." "The 30 days," I said. "What I told you at that table, I meant every word of it." "I know you did," Renee said. We talked for another 20 minutes about what those 30 days needed to actually look like, not in the abstract specifically. A call to Priscilla to start the honest conversation about what, if anything, a legitimate role for Renee might look like down the line. The conversation with Curtis, which she still had to have properly, and the conversation with Sophie, which I told Renee was hers to start, that I wasn't going to script it, and that it needed to be real. Renee said she understood. We said goodnight. The conversation with Sophie happened 2 Sundays later, not the first one after the dinner, the one after that. Renee came to the house on Winding Way at 9 in the morning, Sophie's usual time, and Sophie was already there. I made coffee and took it out to the shop and let the two of them have the kitchen. I don't know everything that was said between them. I know it took an hour and 10 minutes, and that when they came looking for me out back, both of them had the specific look people get when something true and difficult has finally been said out loud. Renee looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she looked at me. "She's got her grandmother's eyes," she said. "She does," I told her. "Mom would have liked how this turned out," Renee said. I thought about Margaret at that kitchen table 2 years before she died, telling a 13-year-old about builders and takers, planting a seed in exactly the right soil and trusting the season to bring it up when it needed to. She'd have liked how it turned out. She'd have known it would, long before any of us did. That was Margaret. That was always Margaret. Here's where things stand today. Pruitt Millwork is still running. The board is active. Denise Okafor has been formally named general manager with full operating authority, a step I'd been circling for 2 years, and that the estate process finally forced into the open. Renee isn't on the board. But 8 weeks after that dinner, she made an appointment with Priscilla, not to challenge the documents, but to ask what an honest, earned path toward involvement might look like if she could show, over real time, that something in her had actually changed. Priscilla called me after that meeting. "It's the right question," I told her. "I don't know the answer yet, neither does Renee, but asking it honestly is where anything worth building actually starts." Sophie is still at the house most Sundays. She's a senior now, taking a business elective she says isn't nearly as useful as what she learned at that dining room table in June, which might be the most honest review of a high school class I've ever heard. She asked me not long ago what I thought her grandmother would say if she could see how all of it turned out. I thought about it for a real, honest minute. Then I told her Margaret would probably say something short and quietly devastating and a little bit funny, because that was Margaret. And then she'd go right back to whatever she was doing, because she'd already seen it coming, and she'd already done her part, and the rest was always going to be up to the rest of us. Sophie laughed at that. The real kind, the unguarded kind, The kind that sounds like the person underneath the performance. She looks the most like her grandmother in the moments she doesn't know anyone's watching. I'm 71 years old. I built something for 45 years out of a rented garage on Del Paso Boulevard, and my wife planted a seed in a 13-year-old 2 years before she left us. And on a Saturday evening in June, at my own dining room table, that girl stood up and set an envelope down that told everyone in that room, in about 4 seconds, exactly who had been paying attention all along and who hadn't. My wife built that too. She built everything that ever mattered in this family. Before you go, do this for me. Hit that like button. Subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting here. More 17-year-olds who stood up when it counted. More seeds planted in exactly the right person at exactly the right time. More envelopes opened at family tables that said something nobody in the room was ready to hear. Every one of those stories deserves to find the people who need it tonight. Drop a comment right now and tell me, son, daughter, wherever you're sitting tonight, where in the world you're watching from. Tell me your story, whatever part of it you're ready to put into words. This is a place full of people who understand what it costs to build something worth protecting, and what it means to find, right when you need it most, the one person in your family who saw it before you did. My name is Walter Pruitt. I'm 71 years old. My wife planted a seed in 2020, and it grew exactly when it was supposed to. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.